We're here in an African American museum to talk about African American history, so much of which is truly unknown today. For example, few know of James Armistead, a black patriot inspired during the American Revolution who helped make possible the 1781 Yorktown victory that established America as an independent nation. Or Peter Salem, a black patriot who was a hero of the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. He also fought as one of the legendary Minutemen and was a soldier at the battles of Saratoga and Stony Point. And in the famous picture, the 1776 crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, two men depicted at the front of the boat include Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, two black patriots who served with George Washington and the American generals during the Revolution. Few are aware that many of the soldiers who fought during the American Revolution were black. And unlike the later segregated regiments in the Civil War, many of the units in the American Revolution were fully integrated, with black patriots fighting and dying side by side with their white fellow comrades and soldiers. And equally unknown is much of what occurred in black political history. That history will surprise and perhaps even shock you. But as you will see, it's a history based on indisputable facts and documents. Too often today, only a handful of the heroes from black history are presented, much like showing only a snapshot or two out of several albums of photos. Too much is not seen, and often too much is wrongly assumed just from the little that is seen. One of the world's oldest history books, the Bible, offers a good lesson on this point. We all know the Bible story of David's victory over Goliath, yet the Bible also tells the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and of his failure with his son Absalom. If all we learned about David were his failures, that would not be the complete story. On the other hand, if all we learned about David were his victories, neither would that be the complete story. It takes all of these accounts to present the full, accurate story. So from the Bible, and from former writers in black history, such as William Nell, Carter Woodson, Benjamin Quarles, Joseph Wilson, Booker T. Washington, Edward Johnson, and others, we learn that you must present the good, the bad, and the ugly to get the full story not only of history in general, but of African American political history in particular. Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. He explained,
I was on the anti-slavery question fully committed to the doctrine touching the pro-slavery character of the Constitution. I advocated this with pen and tongue according to the best of my ability. However, upon a latter reconsideration of the whole subject, I became convinced that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence as the supreme law of the land. Now, here was a radical change in my opinions.
But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglas not read that clause? Yes, he had. Then how could he conclude what he did about the Constitution? It was very simple. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The Southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the Southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slaveholding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. It was an anti-slavery provision designed to limit the number of pro-slavery representatives in Congress. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery. In 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing the Northwest Ordinance. That law forbade slavery in any of the federal territories then held, and for this reason, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin all eventually came into the nation as free states. On the federal level, progress was being made toward ending slavery and achieving full civil rights for black Americans. Another important point in black political history occurred 3 years later. In 1792, according to the website of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party was started by Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Party definitely played a role in black political history, a role that will be examined shortly. Some years later, in 1808, Congress continued its fight against slavery by abolishing the slave trade. A famous sermon commemorating the abolition of the slave trade was given by the Reverend Absalom Jones, the first black bishop of the Episcopal Church in America. His sermon was delivered in the famous St. Thomas's Church. Very few today know that in 1808 Congress abolished the slave trade, or that Bishop Absalom Jones delivered such a compelling sermon. Although slavery still had not been abolished in all the states, things definitely were moving in the right direction. Yet a major reversal was about to occur.